Welcome back to our church history course in the Foursquare Leadership Institute. We are at lecture video number 5 today, and we're moving ahead, trying to move ahead so we can give plenty of time to more recent activities. And today, as we approach the Middle Ages, what are known as the Middle Ages, I want to talk a little bit about the rise of the papacy, the rise of the Pope, because there wasn't always a Pope in what was known as the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, and also to talk a little bit about the rise of the Holy Roman Empire and the influence of the popes in all of that. And I want particularly just draw attention today and then in our next study to the importance of understanding how the Roman Catholic Church came about together with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which we understand a lot more today in terms of the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, but they're really just part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. We've previously noted that the early church was one Catholic church, one universal church, Catholic with a small c, but that it had developed as the church had grown and gone both east and west. It had developed into two distinct identities, really. Still one church, still fundamental basis of faith and agreement, but two centres of Christianity. In the West, the Latin-speaking church, based primarily around Rome, and in the East, the Greek-speaking church, which was to be centred around Constantinople. In the East, each had developed their own distinct practices whilst remaining faithful to their beliefs and their sense of being one church. The Eastern Church began to develop somewhat more after Constantine had moved the headquarters of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, what we now call Istanbul. And it was really about this time that the Roman Empire had spread very widely and was kind of at its height and its power and its most influential. But the Roman Empire began to go into decline and influence from around about the 4th to the 6th centuries AD. And that is important for what begins to happen next. I said in the previous video, there's a lot of history and a lot of geography involved in this period of time, and I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at those kind of things. So the Roman Empire has gone into decline and influence from the 4th to the 6th centuries AD. We've also seen that the pattern of church leadership was elders, deacons and bishops, and also have identified how certain, when there were the churches were independent, they had their own local leadership, but when they began to develop several churches in a particular city or a particular geography, quite often one of the bishops rose to a kind of prominence and began to be the person who assumed some authority and was particularly a guide. And that happened more and more as the church began to grow. But there was no concept of one bishop or one pope having a primacy over the whole church and of all the bishops. That was not a concept that was around in the time of the early church. But from the perspective of church history, we need to recognize that there have been popes and that there is a pope, and we need to understand how all of that came about. I think we need to recognize, and this can be difficult for a lot of people, that A, the Roman Catholic Church, and B, the Eastern Orthodox Church are part of the body of Christ, and both continue to be quite influential, more so the Roman Catholic Church than necessarily the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, the two extremes of how one views the Pope are that there are those who see him as the Vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ on the earth. Or you might belong to that group of people who consider the Pope to be the Antichrist. Whatever view you have, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of how that role has come about and how the Church has developed over a period of time. So the concept of papal primacy is hotly debated in the Church. Eastern Orthodox churches and the Protestant churches reject the Roman Catholic interpretation of papal primacy, and the divisions remain deep. Although we have to recognise that most denominations have a leader of some nature, but how much authority that person has varies quite considerably. So some have referred to the Pope as the Vicar of Christ and others the Antichrist, but the reality for church historians is that there have been popes, and we need to understand who they were and what they did. And when we come to think, as we will a little bit later on and then next week, about Eastern Orthodox Church, quite important, because in more recent years there have been quite a number, if I might use this word somewhat carefully, defections from evangelical churches and indeed charismatic and Pentecostal churches to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Not so much to the Catholic Church, but to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is often seen to be much more solid. The word papal comes from the word papa and meant father, and it was a term of endearment for all bishops, but soon the word became the exclusive title of one bishop, the Bishop of Rome. Despite persecution, the church in Rome grew large and strong. Rome was the imperial capital, and the church there was large and wealthy. Even before Constantine was the emperor, it grew to over 30,000 members, including 150 clergy. And this is by the mid-200s AD. And size, then as now, means influence. So the Church of Rome was very influential and was accorded a lot of honour, but it did not have any authority over any other churches outside of Rome itself, at least early on. We might say that the Church of Rome and its bishop had honour, but no jurisdiction. We've talked last time about the rise of heresy within the church and false teachings. And if we remember that the trouble that churches had with heretics, especially Gnosticism, and the early church leaders saw the need to keep the leadership tight and more in control to help fight the heretics. Early writers like Irenaeus in the 2nd century began to refer to Peter and Paul as the founders of the church in Rome, and that subsequent bishops of Rome were successors to the apostolic tradition. Irenaeus and others felt that a list of bishops that traced back to Peter would help safeguard the apostolic message. So this is one of the reasons that leadership was very important indeed. Now, I've mentioned that although formally a pope is a somewhat later development, there were other popes. And the first pope was Bishop Damasus, who he was the Bishop of Rome, and really the first one to in any sense think of himself as a pope having authority over other bishops. In May of 381 AD, Emperor Theodosius called a general council at Constantinople, and he wanted to bring order to the church. But to this council he only invited bishops from the eastern part of the church. He did not invite any bishops from the western part, including the Bishop of Rome. Now, there were several things that happened at this particular council in May 381. The Nicene Creed had already been developed by this time, and it was reaffirmed and accepted by this council. But then this council declared that the Bishop of Constantinople was second only to the Bishop of Rome, because his city, Constantinople, is the new Rome. The centre of the Roman Empire has been shifted from Rome to Constantinople, and so now it's thought that the Bishop of Constantinople is second only to the Bishop of Rome. But the following year, 382 AD, there was another council held in Rome, and Rome declared that their church would be the first among churches because of Jesus' words to Peter, that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So we've seen and touched very briefly previously that this is the doctrine that Jesus was building the church on Peter himself rather on Peter's confession of faith in Jesus Christ. And so now Rome begins to exert a little bit more pressure and says that it is the first amongst the churches. Now, the two parts of the church, the Greek church and the Eastern church, begin somewhat to grow apart and in different ways. In 451 there was another church council held, and this council declared that the Bishop of Constantinople was equal to the Bishop of Rome. So we've seen this kind of progress, that the Bishop of Rome, or the first council in Constantinople, saying that the Bishop of Constantinople is second only to the Bishop of Rome, and then the Western Church elevating the church in Rome to be superior and first amongst all of the others. And now in 451 the Bishop of Constantinople is declared to be equal to the Bishop of Rome. So we now have some contention between these two parts of the church, and they do develop in somewhat different ways. Most especially there is the sense in which the Western Church, the Roman Church, maintains some separation from the world, of being in the world but not of the world, whereas the Eastern Church sees almost a coming together of the state and the church, It's almost, one could say, that the state is the church is the state. And there became allegiance, as there continues to be, to national governments in that area. But there is, nevertheless, still one church in two sections. So there is some division beginning to arise, and some pushing for Rome to have greater authority than Constantinople. But there's a number of external circumstances that need to be taken into account in this period, and this particular movement. And this reminds me that God isn't just at work in the church, he's at work in the world. Even though that world doesn't necessarily recognize God, he's at work in the world and in the circumstances, and always working out his purposes. And if that was the case back in the latter days of the 1st century, it's equally true today, and we need to just see his divine activity. I've mentioned already that Rome, the Roman Empire, is declining in power and influence. It's no longer able to hold itself together. It's grown rather large and is just in many parts of the earth, and that is now very difficult to be held together. And so the Roman Empire is losing its power, particularly after this move to Constantinople. The Roman Empire has really in many ways not known a great deal of attack. But now there are a number of racial groups that are rising up, and again I just point out that this is history. You could read more about this if you wanted to do from elsewhere. I don't want to go into all the details of it, but in particular the Germanic races were rising up now, and they had pretty much been on one side of a river and Rome on the other side of the river, and that was the way people had existed. But now the German races were rising up, and there were attacks on the Roman Empire. And the year 476 really marks the end of what we have called the Christian Roman Empire in the West. That's from the time that Constantine became the emperor and Christianity became the national religion. And we begin to move into a period of what we call in history terms the Dark Ages. And one of the important aspects of this for us to see is that now, as this one pope and one church in Rome is trying to push itself forward a bit more, there is an increasing political power comes to the papacy, as well as the religious power. So in the first of these popes to experience this kind of change was Leo I, and he ruled from 440 AD as the Pope, Bishop of Rome, until 461. So about 20 years. And he was one who also appealed to Peter and the rock passage to justify his claim to supremacy over all of the bishops. He claimed to be the supreme head of all Christendom. The dynasty of Peter, Prince of the Church, was now established. Leo was in the right place at the right time for the outcomes he wanted. He was keen for power, and he had the opportunities to acquire it. There were invasions into the Roman world by Attila the Hun, who some of you will have heard of from your history in school. And there was turmoil in many places. And this was all heading for Rome. Emperor Valentinian III knew Italy was under threat by the barbarians, and he knew the power and the influence that had amassed to Leo. And so he agreed to support Leo's position as the supreme leader of the church. The imperial court in Italy was not strong by itself. It needed the power of Leo, Pope Leo, and of the church and the church to meet the crisis of invasion. For some 620 years, Rome had not known an invader. And in 452 AD, Attila the Hun appeared ready to strike the city of Rome itself. But Leo met him and negotiated a peace. This gave Leo more prestige and power than anything else could have done. Rome did not get sacked, and the Pope had saved the city. And so once again his prestige now rises. In 455, another group of people that we would have heard on in history lessons, and we use their name for other reasons today, but in 455 the Vandals turned up to attack Rome. This time the emperor was there, but this time the emperor's own bodyguards murdered him, and the armed army mutinied, and everyone was panicking. Again, Leo met the invading army. He was escorted not with an army, but by some priests. He pleaded with the Vandal king that he not burn the city. And the king agreed to this, but he did plunder the city for 2 weeks. Every house and every palace was robbed, and the city was stripped of all wealth. But a massacre was avoided, and the city was still standing, and again Leo had saved the day. Leo then assumed the title Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of religion throughout the empire, or what was left of it. It has been Leo who had succeeded where the emperor had failed. He was the ultimate power now. One scholar has said Peter had come to power. Interestingly, the barbarians had conquered Rome, but the Christian faith would conquer the conquerors. The Germanic people did embrace Christianity because it seemed more powerful than their gods. The year 476, as I have mentioned, marks the end of the Christian Roman Empire. The long line of emperors that had started with Augustus back in 27 BC come to an end, and the conquering German leaders and their descendants ruled from then on. But the Pope in Rome and the Church, which was separate from the state in the Western Empire, was also a powerful force. We come then to another Pope, and not necessarily a bad Pope. We tend to think of the popes, I think, as being bad. But Gregory the Great becomes Pope from 590 to 604. In 590, towards the end of a horrible plague that was killing many in Rome, including the Pope at the time, Pelagius II, a new Pope was finally elected, a monk named Gregory. He spent 14 years as Pope and is remembered as Gregory the Great. He was great in the way he cared for the poor and was genuinely concerned for people's spiritual health. He even wrote a book called Pastoral Rule. In it, he highlighted some things that our own modern Protestant leaders need to remember sometimes. Quote, "He who, by necessity of his position, is required to speak the highest things, is compelled by some necessity to exemplify the highest." Actually, when I was reading afresh about Gregory the Great, he reminded me very much of the current Pope, Pope Francis. Again, Pope Francis is a Jesuit, a monk, and he's very much turned things upside down in the Vatican. Gregory the Great got into a debate about titles with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who liked to be called the Universal Bishop. But Gregory insisted on calling himself the servant of the servants of God. Someone tried to call him the Universal Pope once, and he bit back at them and declared, "I have said that neither to me nor to anyone else ought you to write anything of the kind. Away with words that inflate pride and wound charity." At the same time, he did claim and exercise supreme authority over the whole Church of Christ. He was horrified and frightened of becoming proud, and he wrote about that a lot. He saw it as the root of all vices. Gregory had been a monk and continued to live like one, even as the Pope, again much as Francis does. He lived simply and he maintained disciplines in his own life, and he was described as monastic, ascetic, superstitious, hierarchical, haughty and ambitious, yet humble before God. Gregory sought to Christianize Britain during his period as the Pope, and he sent missionaries. He sent Augustine to England and saw great fruit as the Christian faith got strongly planted in that land. He enjoyed reading the early church fathers and thinking about theology, though he was no great mind. His teachings did become part and parcel of the Middle Ages Catholic teaching, and I'll just mention some of these here. Adam's sin means that all have a weakened but not destroyed freedom of will. Once moved by grace, we respond in our free will and do good works that win us merit. Baptism freely grants forgiveness for all past sin. Sins committed after baptism need to be atoned for by penance, a form of punishment inflicted on oneself rather than get God's punishment. Penance does involve sincere repentance as well as confession and good works. Penance and atonement of sin, the good deeds that accompany penance, must involve sacrifice and suffering. Whether or not we have done enough to atone for the sins is unsure until after death. He also introduced prayers to the saints. The saints can be turned to in prayer and asked help of. Relics from past saints had power to assist you, and there was the introduction of purgatory. This would be the final place to atone for sins. And he also introduced the teaching that the Eucharist, communion, literally nourishes and strengthens our spiritual life. The elements are literally the body and blood of Jesus. By participating in the elements, we shorten our time in purgatory. There were a number of other things that were introduced at that particular time. I want to introduce here as well the topic of the Holy Roman Empire. So not the Christian Roman Empire or just the Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a complex study in many ways, and rightly or wrongly, to try and make this more simple for you guys, I've turned to Wikipedia to get a little bit of information, some simple information on the Holy Roman Empire. It's important to note that in fact it didn't get that name until the 13th century, but the concept of this empire was already existing. The Holy Roman Empire was a multi-ethnic complex of territories in Western and Central Europe that developed during the early Middle Ages and continued until its dissolution in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. The largest territory of the empire after 962 was the Kingdom of Germany, though it also came to include the neighbouring kingdoms of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Burgundy, the Kingdom of Italy, and numerous other territories. On the 25th of December 800, Pope Leo III crowned the Frankish king Charlemagne as emperor, reviving the title in Western Europe, more than 3 centuries after the fall of the earlier ancient Western Roman Empire in 476. This is important again in seeing power being exercised by the papacy in an area of not only the church and religion, but of exercising power in society. That this Bishop of Rome is the one who crowns the king. And this becomes a practice amongst many of those nations that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, that they turned to the Pope to have him crown them and authorize them in their position. So this papal figure, this papacy, is taking this role now, where almost the kings are subject to him, the kings and governments. And of course, if I may just trace some more recent history in our own country here, and the troubles in Northern Ireland and indeed wider Republic of Ireland previously, many people today don't understand some of the history of the late Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley and his sort of anti-papal position. But this stems back to this kind of thing where the Pope held this authority over national leaders, and to bring that into that situation that has been around in our own nation previously, what Ian Paisley and some of the other MPs did not want was that their nation should be subjected to the Roman Catholic Church and submitted to the Roman Catholic Church. And that, although that's much more political these days, that was part of the background to issues in Ireland. So several kings were crowned by the emperors, as emperors and kings, by the Pope. And this just continued to strengthen this idea of the supremacy of the Pope. And so now the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is beginning to develop, and developing only in the West, but developing to this point where it is taking an overall leadership over many of the national states. Pope Gregory the Seventh, who was Pope between 1073 and 1085, he accepted papal supremacy, and this supremacy was not given by the state but by the church, and he sought to return to the apostolic ways. Gregory introduced the College of Cardinals, and he set this college up, and ultimately it was to be this college that elected the popes in the future. If I turn again on this. One of his greatest achievements, really, Pope Gregory VII, was that in 1059 when the College of Cardinals was set up, and that group would be responsible to elect the Pope. He also worked for the enforcement of celibacy, and this actually left many wives and children destitute when they were not allowed to stay with the clergy who had been married up until this time. He also sought to abolish a number of corrupt practices. In 1073, he was elected as Pope, and he was one of the most powerful popes in all of history. Some of his beliefs and achievements are as follows. He taught that the state was under the Pope, not equal and not above the Church, but under the authority of the Church. For the loyalties of men, the spiritual has primacy over the secular. These kind of things will become a big issue for people like Calvin and Luther later on. He taught that the family of all people can only find true unity in Christ and in obedience to the laws of God. In 1075, he prohibited any non-church official from appointing any church officials to office. In other words, only the church leaders could appoint other church leaders. Here I would just point out again some of the differences. There is in the United States of America a distinction between state and church. There's no interference normally from one to the other. Here in the United Kingdom, any person who is being elevated to become a bishop in the Church of England, that they are proposed by government and not by church. So that's quite important. And Pope Gregory VII introduced something that was to become one of the most powerful tools down the centuries, and that was of excommunication, putting people outside of the church and not allowing them to receive communion. All the kings of the different nations in Europe were appointing their own church officials at this time, so this changes. In 1076, Gregory excommunicated the Emperor Henry IV, a German king, for the practice of buying theological office and lay investiture, land issues between church and the state. The Pope ordered Henry to Rome to explain himself. Henry refused to come and declared the Pope unfit to rule, and the Pope excommunicated him, and he declared he was no longer the emperor. His subjects were no longer bound to their oath of loyalty to him. Plots were hatched among German nobles to overthrow Henry, and when it became clear that he was not going to win this contest with the Pope, he repented and asked forgiveness of the Church in 1077. Once again, this resulted in more power and prestige for the papacy. I'm sure we will return to this issue of church and excommunication. There came about a teaching that there is no salvation outside of the church, and because of the spiritual nourishment that came from receiving Holy Communion. Therefore, this was a real threat to threaten somebody that they were going to be put outside of the church, to be excommunicated. They would no longer, they could no longer find that salvation, as it were, because salvation is only in the church. The help that they needed could only be found in there. And that nourishment that these people understood that came from receiving communion was taken away from them. And so very much the threat of excommunication hanging over somebody was really quite a terrible thing for them to experience. one final pope for us to quickly look at, and I hope you're seeing this ever increasing power that is being gathered to the papacy. First of all, the Church of Rome, or the Church of Constantinople, was second only to Rome, and then the Bishop of Rome becoming more superior. Now the beginnings of a fight between the leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western churches, etc. And now this involvement in world affairs, politics and world affairs, begins to just give more power to the Pope. Innocent III trained as a lawyer for the church, a canon lawyer, an expert in church government. He had an exalted view of the papacy, the successor of Peter. He saw himself as the mediator between man and God, as someone below God but above all men, someone who could judge all but could not be judged by any. He saw the secular government rulers as totally answerable to the Pope and the Church. The sun gives the moon its light, and the Pope gives rulers their power. These are some interesting thoughts, actually, that we will maybe look at in some of our assignments of where state and church sit, and whether the church should have any power over society formally, etc. Spiritual penalties were given to those who disagreed with Pope Innocent III. As I've mentioned, excommunication, withholding the sacraments. Whole lands could be placed under an interdict, suspending all public worship and the sacraments from whole lands of disobedient rulers. Innocent III used this interdict 85 times to get his way with local governments and kings. One famous example being against King John in England, who tried to appoint his preferred man to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. He lost and acknowledged papal authority over himself. England then remained a vassal state, paying taxes to Rome until the time of Henry VIII and the Reformation. Leo also exercised a statewide interdict against France because of Philip Augustus's second marriage. With Philip in his pocket, Leo later suggested that Philip invaded England, playing nation states off against one another. Innocent III was able to take the power of the papacy to new heights. He is considered the most powerful pope who ever lived. He gave his successors a position of incredible power and influence. He established a papal state, independent from the empire, in 1207, giving the papacy territorial as well as spiritual powers. I want to just stop here because next time we're going to look at the final split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. In the period that we've just been discussing, over in the East, in Constantinople, the church was developing a different way. The state and church were merging more and more, and what was to become Eastern Orthodox religion was evolving. The state was becoming so religious that the society was almost replacing the church, and the old teachings about disciples not being of this world were totally forgotten. And there was, of course, the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. But the patriarch was looked to as the leader in all things religious. So there was some element still there of the emperor looking after the political and the patriarch looking after the religious. This again will raise issues for us in our thinking about the relationship between church and state. And should it be that these two, as was mentioned there, that the two have come together to that point where the society was so religious that it had almost replaced the church. Well, we'll look more at that next time. because we've been building up, and I think maybe this has been a bit of a tedious lecture, but we've been building up to a point at which there is about to be a clash, major clash, between the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this is going to affect the relationship between Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church for over 1,000 years, right up until the most recent times. So my apologies that this has been a rather tedious, I think, study, but hopefully it will have helped you to see how the supremacy of the papacy came about and some of the issues that were raised through it.